Anyway, I'm really delighted that all of you could come, giving up the early hours of Halloween Eve. But there's time afterwards if you want to go trick-or-treating or something. It gives me a lot of pleasure today to welcome back. It hasn't been gone that long, but welcome back Tin El-Kadi. And in a way, well, it's not really welcoming back. Kenddrick Chan works with LSE Ideas. Both of them are at Oxford University now. Both of them are working on China's technological impact in developing countries. Tin is going to be speaking to the topic, Infrastructure and Influence, China's Digital Presence in the Global South and its Development Impact. So Tin has published in Development and Change and Global Policy and Information Society. She's now working in Oxford University at the Technology and Industrialization for Development Center, which is based in Queen Elizabeth House, part of the International Development Department at Oxford. Tin's research has taken her to China. She has direct experience with Huawei in China, then into especially Egypt and Algeria, looking at Chinese investments with quite a strong and empirical base to the research based on extensive interaction, not only with Chinese companies, but with US tech companies, with Algerian and Egyptian, both corporate people as well as government officials. And it's really kind of path-breaking research. Kenddrick, in a similar way, is right on the frontier. After he studied at the LSE in the International Relations Department, he was working for the Tony Blair Institute. I won't say for his sins. And he rightly left the Tony Blair Institute and is with LSE Ideas now, working and helped to set up their program in technology and international affairs. He's in Oxford, working on the digital international order, a question of African agency, a topic I really like. He's had experience and research in Rwanda and Ghana and in Zambia. So, unlike some of our talks, where you have old sage people like me, we have young firebrands, two of them tonight, to liven up our lives and also to be a good reason for putting off trick-or-treating for Halloween. Without further ado, I should mention, this session is being recorded. It'll be available on YouTube afterwards, sometime after the talk. And so you should know that, when we go into the Q&A and whatnot. Good, I don't know if I've forgotten anything. I want to welcome Tin El-Kadi to give a talk.
Amazing. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I'm really happy to be here today. It's a real honor for me as a former student to give this lecture. I used to attend these kind of Friday afternoon lectures when I was a master's student here myself. And I'm really happy to see that a lot of you have a keen interest on the topic. So for everyone just following the news, you'd know that the topic of the globalization of China's digital industry is a big one, right? It's one of these few topics that seem these days at least to capture a lot of media attention, especially against the backdrop of this current US administration. So in this presentation, I'm going to mainly focus on my research that focuses on the developmental impact of the globalization of some of these Chinese firms and try to have a perspective from developing countries, right? Like, because as you know, a lot of the debate is very much centered around kind of the US's fear of losing its hegemony around the digital space. But as a development scholar, I'm very much interested in what kind of this phenomenon of the rise of China as a digital superpower means for other developing countries, so like low and middle income countries. So broadly speaking, this is the structure of the talk. I'm going to start by talking about the rise of China as a digital superpower. How do we come to this situation? The dominant debate and my theoretical framing. And then I'll be talking about some of my findings in my own PhD research on the developmental effects of China's digital presence in other developing countries before concluding. So, FDI and technology transfer, like one of the first phases of China's emergence as a digital superpower. So what you can see from this picture is like a Foxconn factory. So Foxconn is the world's largest electronic manufacturer and subcontractor. Lots of big firms in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up until now were subcontracting parts of their manufacturing process to like firms like Foxconn manufacturing from China. So the Chinese economy, starting from the late 70s, started integrating in like progressively in the global economy, becoming the world's factory in some terms. But FDI played a very important role at the time in transferring advanced technologies and know-how to China's ICT sector, right? A lot of firms were trying to cut their costs by using some of China's cheap and qualified labor going into these factories around Shenzhen and other special economic zones in the 80s and 90s. So China heavily relied on transnational capital to start building its capabilities, in particular US firms. And this kind of contributed in job-starting technology transfer. There's just a point I would like to make here. I mean, because of time, I'm not going to previous phases, but you know, China's emergence as a tech superpower did not only start with the opening up of its economy and its integration in global value chains. Like the Maoist era from 1949 to the late 70s also contributed hugely in building human capital. And there's big investments in universities, in research and development during the time, even during the Great Leap Forward, which is a period known in the literature and like in kind of common history as like a really terrible phase of Chinese history. If you look at the number of universities in China during that time, and technical universities, there was a really big expansion. So at the time the Chinese economy opened up to the world, there was already a strong base and qualified human capital. So I'm not going to that phase just for the sake of time, but it was a very important phase as well, and it's a big part of explaining the Chinese success. The second phase, broadly speaking, comes in the early 2000s, and during that phase, the Chinese Communist Party leadership realizes that this whole trajectory of FDI-dependent growth of the 80s and 90s risked very much trapping China in low value-added activities, right, at the bottom of global value chains. There was a fear and a realization within the Chinese Communist leadership, that the Chinese Communist Party, that, I don't know if you can still hear me.
You have to, no. It might be on mute.
No, it's not. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, if I do this. There was this realization that China might be trapped at the bottom of global value chains. And there was a fear that a lot of the activities were basically labor-intensive activities that just relied on kind of assembling components, but a lot of the activities done in these Foxconn factories and so on were not generating high returns, and were kind of like, China was kind of like this low-tech, low-value-added hub where big corporations, mainly from the US and Europe, would go to manufacture and assemble their products. So there was a shift towards what's known in the literature as indigenous innovation. So developing indigenous capabilities to innovate, right? So that was a very important shift in the early 2000s. So this was underscored eloquently, actually, by the ambassador, and like it was in France during one of the visits of China's Minister of Commerce, where he characterized China's position in the global economy at the time as trading 800 million shares for 1/8 a 380 Airbus, right? With like this exchange of like a low value added, kind of labor intensive country having to sell a lot of these goods to be able to acquire advanced technology. And there was a whole bunch of efforts at the time to try and build more technological capabilities within China and develop China's own brands, research and development, and China's own innovation capabilities. And a whole set of industrial policies were adopted at the time. Things like joint ventures were kind of imposed on foreign firms. There was important institution policies, research and development centers also were created, and lots of incentives and subsidies for firms going into kind of more high value added activities at the time. Well, obviously, China was able to do that because it's the largest market in the world. It was at the time, at least, and so it had the capacity to compel foreign capital to engage in these joint ventures and share some of the technology they had. So there was this whole mechanism of exchanging markets for technology. So if you want to access the Chinese market, you have to, at the same time, share technology. So you can see here in this graph published by the Financial Times showing kind of patents enforced by origin, by country. Towards the mid-2000s, there's this continuous increase in innovation, in numbers of patents coming from China. And at this stage, like if we count just patents, China is winning the innovation race, if that's the measure we're using, right? And this accounts for like patents in all sectors. So it's not just in AI or in the digital sector, but it's in other fields as well. And lots of Chinese tech champions started like appearing and growing towards that time. So here it's some of them by market evaluation. You can see ByteDance, which is like the mother company of the famous TikTok. Lots of firms like Alibaba, which are like key platforms and e-commerce businesses like in China and also abroad. Didi, Huawei, Shein, which has become a very big e-commerce retailer of fast fashion. So it was towards that, it started very much in the mid-2000s where we started seeing big investments and big Chinese tech champions emerging. And policies, often there is a big debate about the existence of the Chinese firewall. This idea that within China, for any of you who's been to China, you cannot access some big US platforms such as Google, that's YouTube, Facebook, and others. But from a development perspective, this was in many ways used as a protectionist measure that allowed Chinese firms to capture the Chinese market, grow, but also then expand to other markets. Oh, yeah, I found this website and I think it's quite cool. It's an interactive heat density map of the 2024 AI patent landscape. And you can see how it's divided really mainly between two big poles, and that's the US and China. There is some activity in Europe and here in South Asia, a bit in the Middle East, but most of it is captured by these two groups. This website is actually very cool. You could go and have a look, and it shows you lots of interesting things. Though there is an important difference to keep in mind, because this is capturing mainly the number of patents, but there is a big debate on the quality of some of these AI patents, because not all patents are born equal, and some are more innovative and useful for advancing technology, especially commercialization, than others. Okay, so there's still a debate, even though I feel that in recent years it's kind of becoming clearer, what is behind the success of China and its emergence as a digital superpower. So the big debate, especially for you studying development studies here, about, is it the market, is it the state? What combination of both explains the success of the Chinese story? And so still in a lot of business journals and a lot of reports until now, there is the idea that these Chinese tech champions I just mentioned succeeded despite the Chinese state, right? It was thanks to the innovation of brilliant tech entrepreneurs such as Jack Ma, who's the CEO of Alibaba and founder, that these companies succeeded, right? It's despite this big Chinese state. It's the idea that, it's the 2001 Chinese accession to the WTO, the privatization of large state-owned enterprises in the 1990s, and this kind of frugal innovation and spirit of these tech entrepreneurs. But then, for any of you kind of engaging with the literature more closely and looking at Chinese statements and policy documents, there's a huge role played by the Chinese state. So, there's a very astute and gradual market opening. It wasn't done in one go. Infant industry protection, local content requirements, industrial policies, pushing local firms, both private and public, to learn and upgrade. That's key. And then government provision of public goods and investment in education and research and development. And this is very clear when we look at the AI race. So, both the US and China now are kind of openly adopting industrial policy strategies to try and win the AI race. So there's the US launch of the AI initiative in 2019, the CHIPS Act in 2022. China has a bunch of similar initiatives, the Generation AI Development Plan, but also other kind of broader industrial policies such as the Made in China 2025, the Internet Plus strategy launched in 2015, and a whole set of other policies that try and push Chinese AI firms to win this race. The US has been quite paradoxically, for a country that has pushed for free trade for many years, it has been very openly circumventing a lot of the regulations of the international trade order by restricting the export of some of its most advanced chips, including the NVIDIA chips like the A100 and the H100 chips, to slow China's AI progress. But to the surprise of many, as you know, back in January 2025, there was the launch of DeepSeek, and a lot of people were not expecting this. It was seen as a surprise for many, because I think a lot of experts in the US had not imagined that AI capabilities in China had developed this much. And the interesting thing with DeepSeek is that, unlike a lot of the OpenAI models and a lot of the big generative AI models in the US, this model was made open source, right? So it's much more accessible for people wanting to code, program, and use it to develop other applications, especially in developing countries. And the other super interesting thing with DeepSeek is that it has the capacity, like its last model is as good as the OpenAI latest model, but it does this with much less computational power. So it's like AI for the poor, or like AI for those who don't have necessarily the capacity to acquire all of these extremely expensive chips, and those who don't have the capacity to have huge computational power and hyperscaler data centers, which are all needed to train AI and develop new models. Okay, so this thriving Chinese industry started globalizing and going outside of China's own borders, mainly at the turn of the century. So that's around the 2000s. And there was a big effort with a policy called the Going Out policy in the early 2000s that pushed a lot of these firms and created like incentives for them to go invest abroad. And developing countries were kind of a natural first step for a lot of these firms. So ZTE and Huawei were extremely competitive in these markets because they managed to provide high quality infrastructure for 10 to 30% of the cost of their competitors, right? So for a lot of developing countries, this was a huge advantage because, as you know, like large scale backbone infrastructure in the ICT sector and telecommunications is very costly, and upgrading, let's say, from 3G to 4G or expanding your network to isolated areas can be very expensive. And so these companies were not only cheaper than their Western competitors, but in a lot of cases actually came with their own funding, as I will explain further in a bit. So that they had access to concessional loans from the China Exim Bank, the China Development Bank, and other sources of Chinese funding. So not only they were cheaper, but they would also bring to these countries the funding to build what is expensive infrastructure. So there's this estimate that's like a bit challenged, but I think it gives an idea of the scale of Huawei's presence in Africa, which says that Huawei built roughly 70% of Africa's 4G network and is set to lead the continent's shift to 5G. Because the way it works is that once you start building infrastructure with one provider, it's much cheaper to upgrade using the same provider than shifting gears. So China's digital footprint is further expanding with the launch of the Digital Silk Road, and that's the digital component of the Belt and Road Initiative, which was launched in 2013, right? And it's about building digital infrastructure of different sorts in developing countries. So broadly speaking, if I had to sum up the Digital Silk Road, it's different segments of kind of the broad digital world. It's obviously made up of different subsectors. So digital infrastructure here, like the leading firms would be firms like Huawei and ZTE, which are ICT original equipment manufacturers. There's the push and the globalization of big e-commerce platforms like Alibaba, JD, Tencent. The construction of smart cities. Here, leading Chinese firms would be firms like Hikvision, which has advanced also AI and surveillance capabilities. Huawei is an important actor in the sector as well. Space and Satellite Corporation, Beidou Navigation Satellite, which competes with the GPS model that a lot of us use. Digital finance and fintech, Alipay, WeChat Pay, are increasing their market shares mainly in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And then AI emerging technologies like DeepSeek and Tencent here are key actors in this sphere. Okay, the dominant debate. Well, as you all know, the dominant debate, like, kind of whenever you turn on the TV or read the news, is a lot about this US-China competition and who is going to win the AI race, right? There's restrictions in chips, restrictions in trade, in scientific collaboration, in a lot of fields to try and prevent China from becoming, kind of the hegemon in this AI race. But there is, deep issues with this debate, especially when we bring it to the discussion of the governance of the internet. So there's this idea that the Chinese come with a completely different model of internet governance, that the US has defended the free internet, the borderless internet, and that it's a model that encourages digital freedom and internet freedom. And then there's this binary dichotomy discourse that says that China is promoting this authoritarian internet model into countries in the global south and imposing its own kind of governance system into other countries through the construction of infrastructure. And there are obviously big issues with this narrative, right? And first of all, it's a very US-centric narrative. It's all about the US kind of being scared of losing its hegemony over the internet. And with the internet, it's quite special because it's kind of like always been seen as like a US industry, from the early days of DARPA investments in the sector and so on, has always been seen as like a US product, kind of. And its tech firms have very much shaped the governance of the internet globally. So it's very US-centric, but at the same time, there is no empirical evidence suggesting that China is imposing its model on other countries. Actually, a lot of literature shows that the Chinese have been really good at adapting different political economies, different contexts, and that they would adjust to different environments. So they've operated in autocracies, they've operated in democracies, and have usually been kind of infrastructural suppliers. And the whole process of China's globalization and its presence in other countries has very much been demand-driven by countries wanting to upgrade and wanting to kind of be at the frontier of the digital economy. So what I try to do in my research is kind of like flip the debate and try to look at it from a developing country perspective, as I mentioned, is trying to understand what the globalization of digital China, in one term, means for technological upgrading and for structural transformation in host economies. Like, does it create new opportunities for digital development? Does it not? Does it create new forms of dependencies? What does this imply for developing countries? Okay, I have a question for you. So if you were to research that, so as development students, how would you measure whether foreign firms or foreign firms in this context contribute to structural transformation or development in host countries? What measures would you take if you were doing this research? Anyone?
Good exam question.
No ideas?
I think give us 1 minute to try and digest the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's still kind of early in the year. So maybe if I asked you the question in May or so, you would have kind of consumed more literature and read more to be able. I mean, there is no wrong or correct answer in this. But what I use in my own research, obviously there are different measures. But to simplify it, because it had to be done within the time frame of a PhD project, I look at digital infrastructure and connectivity. So asking, what does the globalization of China's digital industry or China's big infrastructural projects, what does it mean for connectivity in host countries? Like, what impact does it have on infrastructure? I look at technology transfers, and that's very much key and at the heart of my work. And then I look also at data governance frameworks. So how does the increased footprint of China in the digital sphere shape data governance framework? Are we moving towards more sovereign regimes, less sovereign regimes? How is it shaping the way countries regulate data flows in a way? And so for that, I adopt a theoretical framework that brings together two bodies of scholarly work and two different theoretical traditions. So I use heterodox development economics. So this provides analytical tools for examining technology acquisition, capability building, and structural transformation in latecomer economies. Draws on work of authors like Hirschman, Sanjay, Hajun Chang, which was here a few weeks ago, and Amsden. So it's really kind of thinking of development as not just kind of efficiency gains or like small productivity growth, but thinking about how entire economies can move from what's often low-tech, low-value added activities towards higher productivity, knowledge-intensive and technology-intensive activities, right? And building the capabilities to have more ownership over the technologies, not just being mere consumers of foreign tech, but having the capacity to build some of these and have more ownership over some of these technologies. However, my problem when I started doing my research with this body of work is that it often conceptualizes technology as neutral. There's this idea that, you know, we're studying technological acquisitions and technological upgrading, but there wasn't much debate about what type of technology and what kinds of norms and standards and protocols were embedded in that technology. And that's a lot because for a while we kind of had some dominant actors and in sectors where, you know, you had some key players who, let's say, agreed on the norms and standards. However, when we look at what's happening today in the digital economy and China's presence in developing countries, there is, you know, different sets of norms and standards being diffused. So we need to ask kind of what types of parameters and what types of norms and protocols are shaping this technological upgrading, as it seems that a lot of countries are now integrating different types of digital regimes increasingly. And so for this, I bring in another set of theories and another body of work, which is called technopolitics. It comes from science and technology studies. And what I do, I mean, it's kind of an infrastructural analysis of what's happening. And these frameworks help unpack how technical systems embody and reinforce or enact power through the diffusion of standards, protocols, and norms, right? And there is a long literature on this. So I bring these two theoretical traditions that have not necessarily been in conversation before together in my own work. So I'm going to guide you step by step through the three main parameters I use in my research. So analyzing the impact of the globalization of China's digital industry on infrastructure and connectivity. So here the hypothesis is that because China and Chinese firms are not only cheaper, but also bring in their own funding, they have the capacity and their globalization through infrastructural projects like the Belt and Road Initiative have the capacity to increase digital connectivity, that is internet access, in host economies. And this graph basically shows, it's what I was saying, firms like ZTE and Huawei would be in direct communication, if you want, with overseas operators. So operators are the mobile carriers, let's say Vodafone or O2 in this country. Let's say that O2 wants to expand from 4G to 5G, right? They don't have the technical capacity to do that. They would go to what's called ICT original equipment manufacturers, and these include firms like Cisco, Nokia, Huawei, ZTE, and so on. Ericsson is also an important actor. And then these firms would provide the technical infrastructure to the operator, right? And we all heard a few years ago that like the British government decided that Huawei would not be part of the country's shift to 5G, right? But in a lot of developing countries, these firms have a big advantage because they are able to provide the infrastructure at a competitive cost, and they also bring funding from, as I mentioned earlier, China's kind of big financiers, and these include the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank and so on. So I build like this is I build a data set to try and analyze what like the participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. How does this impact countries' own rates of internet access? So I have this kind of research that uses a quasi-experimental method. That's a difference in difference analysis. And I'm not going to bore you with the methodology, but I basically kind of compare countries that joined the Belt and Road Initiative as a treatment group and countries that haven't joined the initiative, keeping other factors constant. And I try to see what impact this have on their digital connectivity. So I basically find that BRI participation leads to a 2.82% point increase in internet access. And that effect is statistically significant at the 0.1%. And I know it might not seem like much, but in a country of 50 million people, that's like 1.5 million people joining the internet because of the causal effect of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's like kind of the results hold with robustness checks, and it shows that China's digital expansion can have clear benefits for countries in terms of digital access, cost-effective infrastructure, and financial support. However, there are also effects from what I find in the study, having kind of a more qualitative case study in this particular chapter, of lock-in effect. So lock-in effect is that when you have one major technology provider, it might at times kind of capture a market. And I look at this through a case of fiber to the home, like kind of fiber optic cables. And you can see that it does create issues in terms of like interoperability. That is the capacity of other firms to also operate in the same sector, because you have an actor that's becoming so dominant that it's difficult to have other firms also engaging in that market. When it comes to technology transfer, I focus here my research on two key North African countries because I had a great deal of access to these countries, but also because there is a significant amount of Chinese digital investments and projects in these two countries. So in North Africa, actually, what you're seeing here is the Peace Cable, which is like the Pakistan and East Africa Cable Express, has very strategically been named the Peace Cable, not to kind of seem scary, but it connects, you can see it here, but it connects China to Pakistan and then Pakistan all the way to southern France, going through East Africa and North Africa. And in the 13th five-year plan published by the Central Committee of the Communist Party, we find that one of the first mentions of the digital Silk Road was in reference of Arab countries. So it says that the party aimed to develop an online Silk Road with the Arab countries and others. This was actually one of the first mentions of it. And then Huawei has since then gained a lot of market access in North Africa, whether we're talking about 4G networks, 5G networks. Huawei built its only African factory in Algiers. It's like the famous Algiers Huawei factory. I will tell you a bit more about it in a bit. Data centers, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing services. So there is a good deal of activities happening on that side. So yeah, you see here like Huawei and ZTE being very important actors, and a lot of state-to-state level cooperation between Egypt and China, and here like Algeria and China as well. So to measure the level of technology transfer and the effect of technology spillovers, I use this model. So let's say that in the middle you have the Chinese multinational corporation, let's say Huawei, but it could also be Ericsson or any other foreign firm. I try through fieldwork and interviews to assess the extent and kind of quality of the linkages being built here. And so typically when you draw from this literature, and for those of you who will engage with the work of Albert Hirschman, this is the idea of backward and forward linkages. These are here. So for instance, this, you'd expect the multinational to train and provide supervision to local subcontractors. And this is supposed to diffuse new knowledge and like new managerial practices or things that would theoretically be assumed to enhance the productivity of the local firm. You'd have here like how the foreign company deals with suppliers, training, informal guidance, and this in the sector I study would be a forward linkage. So how the foreign multinational with theoretically more advanced knowledge and technology provides training to, here would be mobile operators, so like the Vodafones and O2 of countries. And then you have horizontal spillovers, and I mainly capture this through labor mobility. So that's the idea that, let's say, a local Egyptian engineer who works for Huawei would acquire new knowledge and then move to a company in the same sector. So that would constitute horizontal spillovers, and then, theoretically, he or she would be taking that more advanced knowledge to the host firm. So local workers and managers, and then in the ICT sector, there's also lots of training provided to universities and research centers. So in my interview, so the findings, we'll start with horizontal spillovers very briefly. So there's greater rates of labor localization, I find, in North Africa. So labor localization means basically employing local people. And this is obviously a good first step because there are more opportunities than for knowledge transfer and technology transfer. However, from my fieldwork, I find the existence of a glass ceiling of local employees with top managerial positions all filled with Chinese nationals. So there is very much this pattern in both Algeria and Egypt. There was limited evidence of horizontal spillovers. So Algerian and Egyptian engineers and managers of ICT multinationals tend to move between different foreign firms, right? So Huawei, Nokia, ZTE. If you're working with the big multinationals, there's often, they have an incentive to keep you, and also the salaries tend to be much higher in these big tech multinationals. And this limits kind of the incentive for countries for employees to move to local firms. So we don't end up with a lot of labor mobility, right? When it comes to vertical spillovers, I interviewed suppliers and subcontractors, and they all indicated that Huawei and ZTE, like other foreign firms, provided training to these suppliers and subcontractors, and it's quite kind of a normal industry practice. However, there's limited technology transfer, even in activities assumed to be spillover intensive, such as manufacturing. So I did like a few interviews with people who worked with in the Algiers factory of Huawei. So the factory consisted of building mobile phones, so Huawei phones being manufactured directly in Algeria. However, I spoke to people who explained that most of the components, if not all, actually came from China. And there was a very small rate of local integration. That is, Chinese firms using local suppliers, even for basic components, like the boxes. I was told by someone who was on the assembly line that even the phone boxes came directly from China. So, and the Algerian government was trying to push for a greater rate of integration. They had asked phone manufacturers to have at least 30% of local integration. However, it didn't work out, and this factory ended up shutting down. The Algerian government was trying to push Huawei to include local batteries in their phone to kind of, have a greater rate of integration. But my fieldwork findings showed that Huawei wasn't willing to do that. And so as it stands, the factory is no longer operating. So training to local firms did not convey new knowledge that could help local technological upgrading, from what I find. And then training, actually, when analyzing the data through the lens of my theoretical framework, served as socio-technical links, sometimes creating ecosystems of identifiable local firms that are able to install, troubleshoot, and maintain ZTE and Huawei equipment, right? But this, I want to say, is not specific to the Chinese. Actually, Chinese firms are just learning from the playbook of European and US firms. So kind of providing training, but to teach local actors, firms, engineers to use their own technologies. And that was the same thing in universities. These firms are building lots of partnerships, training local engineers, but a lot of the training, again, conveyed here was about using and learning how to use proprietary technologies from Huawei or ZTE. In terms of data governance frameworks, I'm trying to be quick here just to leave enough time for the Q&A and the discussion. So as you probably know by now, like digital data is assumed to have important economic power. Some people have compared it to the new oil. I'm not sure about this description, and I don't myself like this comparison. But digital data collected through platforms and ICT corporations can be monetized and generate economic value. Right? It's about collecting, storing, and analyzing data. Is part of the data value chain, and this leads data to acquire economic value. There are three dominant, I would say, data governance models, that is like ideas on how digital data should be governed. The US model kind of promotes the free flow of data, is a market-centered model, and it has a narrower set of obligations on how data should be stored and processed. Right. Here we have the EU model, the famous GDPR, which is often seen as the gold standard in terms of protecting data privacy. So here data's flow is more restricted, individual-centered, very much privacy-centered model. The privacy is paramount in the GDPR. While the Chinese model is quite different. So it's a model where data localization in strategic sectors is required. So data generated in China needs to be stored and processed in China. It's a state-centered model, and here state security is very much seen as paramount. In recent years, a lot of developing countries have tried to reproduce China's digital model, because China's digital model has succeeded in many ways in generating spectacular rates of growth, and China's digital economy is leading across the world. And at the same time, interestingly, the Chinese have managed to keep a tight rein on power. So it has achieved something that a lot of leaders and governors across the developing world want to reproduce, that is kind of having digital development, but at the same time keeping political control. And this was big on the headlines a few years ago in 2021, when the Senegalese government signed a deal with Huawei to build its first data centers. And it's a data center that stores the data of different ministries in Senegal. And there is this idea from many policymakers I interviewed in Egypt and Algeria that by collaborating more with Chinese firms, somehow these Chinese firms would be able to help them reproduce this model and this success of kind of trying to achieve digital model by storing more data domestically. So I look at two main cases here. Huawei built data centers for Sonatrach, which is Algeria's leading oil company, and the NRC. So this is Egypt's National Research Center. And in both cases, what I find is that there is this drive in many developing countries to start storing data locally instead of having it abroad, as it used to be the case. Like the African continent, for instance, is the continent with the smallest number of data centers. And this means that a lot of the data generated by ministries, by financial institutions, health data, used and is stored in data centers abroad, right? Like the Netherlands or Ireland have historically been countries that hosted had a lot of data centers hosting African data. The US as well has big data centers doing that. And this can create risks, both for sovereignty, but also if we think of data as the new oil, or at least as something that has economic value, it is important to store data domestically and have the capacity to process it. So a lot of countries have been localizing data. However, what I find in these two cases is that even though initially they both started building their own in-house data centers, very quickly they decided, or after a few years, after facing some technical difficulties, to subcontract the management of their data centers to Huawei, to lease the management and processing of the data to Huawei. So the problem with that is that we're seeing cases of what I call superficial data localization. So we're seeing countries increasingly localizing data domestically, but without having much control over the infrastructure. So, in a way, it's a good first step because data is being, and strategic data is being increasingly localized. However, it's superficial in the sense that local actors are reliant on foreign cloud providers and have very little capacity to manage or process or analyze the data directly. So these foreign firms, and I insist not just the Chinese ones, because I did conduct interviews as well with other foreign suppliers, are becoming custodians of this data. But under the veneer of data localization and greater data sovereignty. But then, leveraging the full developmental power of data from the theoretical lens I use, which is a more heterodox development economics, requires not just the territorial localization of data, but also effective control over the corporations that build it, operate, and maintain the underpinning infrastructure, obviously regardless of the corporation's country of origin. Okay, I'm going to be brief and conclude. So it's very much a mixed picture when we discuss the impact or footprint of China's digital industry in developing countries. But local agency matters. A lot of these processes I described are very much demand-driven, and the policies of host countries end up determining the spillovers of Chinese firms. And there are important things to take into account, like institutional capacities. I study Egypt and Algeria, but findings might be different in countries with kind of greater state capacity or smaller state capacity and so on. The BRI's push to expand connectivity infrastructure is improving internet access in host countries, and that's significant in its own way. But training programs exist, from what I find, but as I explained, they very much serve as socio-technical linkages that are diffusing Chinese infrastructure, hardware, software, and processes and standards that are shaping distinct digital systems that are centered around the consumption of Chinese technologies. And even though the push for data localization might be a step in the right direction, there is a need for greater control from host countries of this very strategic infrastructure. And then ultimately, I think that the evolving US-China rivalry is set to shape the future of the global digital economy. And with the implementation of strategic policies, third countries could hopefully leverage this competition to foster economic development. It doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, countries need to make a choice, but actually the emergence of a challenger to the US hegemony in this sector can create great opportunities for countries to be able to extract more from, extract and get better deals from these large multinational corporations. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening.
Well, thanks very much. Everyone can hear me fine, right? So yeah, thanks very much, Tin, for that very insightful presentation. We all learned a lot. Wow. So as the discussant, you have to bear with me for 10 more minutes. Very quickly, I'll frame my comments around 3 main points. So first, I'll talk about how the technical aspects of technology are now becoming political. Second, what do developing countries want? And what are the implications for infrastructure initiatives like the BRI or the DSR? And how might developing states move forward in this regard? So on the first point, right, contestation is now occurring not just at the political level, but also at the technical level. So in international arenas, we see often, right, certain terms being thrown around, on both sides, the US side and the Chinese side on digital authoritarianism, surveillance technology, Cold War mentality, high-risk vendor, etc., etc. But that's happening at the political level, right? Political posturing and the like we can understand. But at the technical level, I'm talking about the technical working groups of organizations like the IEEE, IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force. We see politics slowly starting to creep in, right, downwards into what was previously relatively more neutral technical venues. And the Chinese initiative of IPv6, IPv6 Plus, it's now sort of like a political football that's being tussled over. We see standards being cast as strategic in nature. You see in 2023, right, the US having a national standard strategy, the EU's push for greater, standardization efforts, and also the famous, 2018 China Standards 2035 that was coming out. It has come up. So the point being is that as companies jostle for technical leadership, right, the reason is that it translates into licensing and commercial downstream advantage, leverage. Right, with Japan, we see 3G. The US was moving very fast on 4G, and now, arguably China for 5G. The main point is, much of the work is still technical, but there is now an explicit political layer in technical work. How does this relate to, Tin's presentation? Boils down to the question of, what do these developing countries, what do they want? For most, I argue, it's economic development. In December 2023, I was offered the position of geopolitical advisor to the president of Malawi to be embedded in his office. I didn't take it up, but it became very clear that his ultimate objective and my task was to help him navigate great power politics, geopolitics, to increase FDI within the country. It was very, very important that he shows that, okay, agribusiness is a thing, it could bring in foreign direct investment. And leaders want economic growth. So technology isn't the end of the equation, right? It's actually the means to the end of economic growth, and with it, of course, social, and other forms of development. Against this build-up, we see different competing infrastructure initiatives coming up, right? The most famous one, BRI, as Tin just said, but we also see, the EU and US efforts competing in this space, within the field of development infrastructure. Right? If we are to think of the Belt and Road or the DSR, Digital Silk Road, as sort of a grand strategy, as so it has been called, then what we see coming out from this part of the world, right, and also over in the US, I argue that it's kind of like a more of a patchwork of initiatives. We see the EU Global Gateway, we see the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or GPII, which was, a rebrand of Biden's, Build Back Better World, B3W. And don't get me started on Trump's Clean Network. I haven't heard any news since its announcement, right? So how are we to assess them and compare them? I think like the EU Global Gateway, what it tries to do when it comes to this sort of initiatives is that, it relies very heavily on de-risking, right? So putting in guarantees to facilitate private capital inflows into these recipient countries. Of the BRI, on the other hand, relies on very heavily, right? State-owned enterprise funding, Exim Bank, as you mentioned, it's therefore faster. But with this, of course, with the speed comes, much more risk for the borrowing state. And the third point, right? So how should developing countries move forward for this? I say that, we should not do something just for the sake of doing something, right? We should not move into technology just for the sake to be seen as we are moving into this field. We have learned from Tin's presentation on how things can go wrong, right? What was meant to be local suppliers in terms of linkages, right, actually ended up being, import companies for Huawei and also Cisco and the like. And, local customers meant to benefit from this technology end up being, salespeople with a ROI, KPI basically for companies like Huawei and Cisco and the like. What then should these governments of developing countries do? The intuitive response might say, okay, it's very simple, right? Just pull all the regulatory levers and, you could fix this issue, right? If you are not having, enough training opportunities, why don't you align your domestic absorptive capacity to mandated capacity building? Get them to train you. Well, the reality is, I think, it's not so simple. The first step, I think, it's do not see technology as the panacea, right? In 2003, Chris Alden, a colleague of mine who Tin will know, wrote, right? Do not see technology or digitalization as the version of what Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake. So instead of cake, let them eat cyberspace. It's not the silver bullet to a lot of issues. With the current AI hype that Tin touched on, I think this is very relevant. There are a lot of governments, racing to have national AI strategies or national digitalization strategies. I have been in the room and privy to quite a number of these sort of national level strategies I've been asked to review, right? And I think that it's the race at this stage runs the risk of being short-sighted and you miss the forest for the trees. What I argue that they should be doing is that you need to do a comprehensive, honest assessment among all the different stakeholders, these countries, right? And say, okay, what do I really need? What are my actual needs, right? National ICT plans are just the start. Even if you have them, do them well, they're just the start. Meaningful implementation is actually what really, really counts. And last point, the big players, we talk about Huawei, Cisco, Qualcomm, and the like, they will all be there. They will always be there, right, out there. The question is, how can these developing countries, how can they maximize their agency so as to utilize these big players out there to benefit the development of their local populations? So with that, I end my comments, and and Professor Putzel will take over.
You're so disciplined. You're great. Both of you, at your time. Okay, we have a good chance for some Q&A, and this is it's really quite a hot topic. So maybe questions have been occurring to you as you go along. Can I get just a showing of hands? Where are the questions? We have some over here, a couple up there. Do we have somebody with a mic down here? Oh, there you are. I was looking for you and I didn't see. Okay, so without me starting off questions, I have quite a few I'd love to fire at you, but I'd like to go straight to the floor. So I saw, I think, one question here, and Deepa can just pass the mic.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Fetsi. I'm a visiting fellow here from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, where I do work around digital public infrastructure. So I found this quite fascinating. So two very quick questions. Just on the data governance aspect, I'm just not sure if I understood whether you were saying that China was essentially having the soft power push of we will invest, but we need to have managerial control over these data centers. Whether that's a soft power push or whether you think it's a hard flex, for lack of a better word. And the second question is, across the continent, and it goes to the previous comment now, we see that when we don't use our agency, we then copy-paste. So we take GDPR and we say, this is how we'll manage all data in the country. So I'm now wondering, in this AI race, your opinion, with the EU AI Act coming out very soon, whether there's an opportunity for the African continent to copy-paste again and hope for the best, or whether they will look towards China to ask them about how we should think about regulation in this space. Thanks.
So does China make a difference from the European companies? Up here, yeah.
Hi, thank you so
No,
much.
behind. And then we'll go to you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very insightful. You mentioned the fact that FDI played a huge role in transferring know-how by utilizing China's cheap and qualified labor. I'm really curious where those, qualifications came about, because in the case of the African countries that you talk about, North African countries that you talk about, there's an issue with the transfer of skills and really kind of bringing in the qualifications. And I'm wondering what, if anything, the Chinese government did to bring about those qualifications, that qualified labor, that led to kind of the transfer, the know-how transfer, essentially, in China.
Okay, good question. We'll take one more here before you do a first round of answers.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. I just have one very quick question about, and also, sorry, thank you for the presentation, first of all, but about whether you think Starlink or other competing sort of actors in that space, pardon the pun, will affect this ecosystem geopolitically.
Okay. So, go ahead.
Oops. Okay, thank you for these great questions. Well, I'm going to tackle the first question on soft power push. That's actually a very interesting question, because from what I find, countries seem, that there is no empirical evidence that I find that China is imposing this model of data localization. It just seems that to be something that a set of large developing countries have started reproducing. It's not China imposing this, but more countries wanting more sovereignty over their own data. And there is a big drive, and it's sometimes it's just normative, like in the case of Algeria and Egypt that I study, and in Algeria in particular, there is kind of this big history of wanting to achieve independence and so on. And so there is this drive to try and reproduce this in the digital sphere, even if it's just discursive. There is a lot of kind of attempts to want to show that there is state control over digital data and so on, even though when we look at what's happening on the ground, there is very little kind of control over the infrastructure that's there. But it's something, in the literature, some authors have described this as the Beijing effect, whereby you'd have countries, it's a bit like the Brussels effect before, but wanting to mimic China's own data governance model. And I think that Chinese firms have been quite smart at positioning themselves as actors that could help countries achieve this in a way. When it comes to AI regulation and GDPR, you're right, there's lots of countries end up copying this, and on the African continent is definitely the case for the GDPR. But from what I find in my own research is that it's done for strategic reasons. The GDPR, so if in North African countries, the EU is the main economic partner for all North African countries. And if you want to do business with the EU, you're better off adopting the GDPR, because a lot of firms won't engage with local corporations if they have a different set of standards governing their data. And so a lot of countries adopt the GDPR purely for strategic market reasons. For AI regulation, it might end up being the same, but it ends up often being a patchwork where countries would borrow different aspects of kind of big regulation frameworks. On the question of China and capabilities, that's a great question. And the Chinese state has a really big history of investing in human capital. There are like really fascinating studies also comparing, for instance, China and India in terms of like human development and investment in health and education. And, since the establishment of the People's Republic in China in 1949, there was kind of concerted effort to invest in human capital. And so even when China opened up to the world economy, there was a great kind of world-class engineers, statisticians, mechanical and engineers in the country. But then an important aspect of the China story that a lot of kind of individual African countries might not be able to reproduce is the fact that it does have access to a huge market. So a lot of companies accepted the deal that was in 2006 of the joint venture for access to China. So for every tech company that wanted to operate in the Chinese market, they had to also build joint ventures with local Chinese firms. But you can only impose this on foreign capital if you have access to such a large market and great also institutional capabilities. For smaller nations, I think the way forward is trying to build more regional cooperation to try and maximize the gains from, kind of what can be extracted from foreign multinationals and foreign capital. The question on Starlink, I think, it's an interesting aspect. I don't think it's kind of big enough, from what I understand, to kind of completely alter this division, and it very much kind of fits within kind of the US big digital world. But it was interesting in some cases, including in Ukraine and so on, to see how some private actors with tremendous amounts of wealth were able to kind of play a role geopolitically in that. And it would definitely be interesting to follow this more. I don't know, I want you, Kenddrick, if you want to add something.
Sure, definitely. I'll add maybe a point on the second question of data governance, right? I think two things. The first one is that one of the things that have not yet been touched upon, I think, is sometimes there's this reliance on external consultants or external parties to help, formulate this sort of data governance frameworks, and I always insist whenever I'm involved, right, that there must be local involvement. There must, you can't come up with a data governance law, and say does this look fine? I'm like, ask a lawyer, ask someone who knows the local laws of the land. I think that's important, right? The role of this sort of commercial or third-party entities. The second one is that I think, Chinese influence, in this area actually goes, just even before, extends beyond this digital infrastructure issue, right? I mean, it was a first mover on the continent in quite a lot of ways. You look back at 2000, with 2000s, right, with NEPAD, the NEPAD that was, that was launched, and also all the way to the establishment of FOCAC. So I think that there is some sort of a currency there, in which the countries feel like, hey, this is an example. And China has been quite effective at, it can be a leading country in the world when it wants to in terms of positioning, and it can also, along the same line, become, a developing country within that category. So it tries to position itself as the leader of the global south, which is one of the things I feel like, maybe there's some kind of appeal over there.
Okay, did I see some hands raised here? So could you could just pass the mic along through the students, and while they pass, just let them pass it along so you don't have to run. Okay. While the mic is going there, I want to ask a question. And it takes off from something Kenddrick said. in terms of what should be the expectation. Zhu Rongji, who played such an important role in kind of welcoming and strategizing how to use foreign capital to the best advantage of China's development, had a clear idea that's a classic development idea. That's what was important first is emulation, not necessary innovation. So China was able, like Japan before it, like all the way back to Alexander Hamilton in the US, to emulate existing technology. So don't we have to kind of ask questions about technology transfer that recognize this pattern right through the history of development, where then you might say that there's something more to be gained by having people with skills, even if they don't possess the cutting edge skill, from this kind of massive inward investment in digital technology in different countries. Anyway, you can hold on to that because now the mic is here. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. So the first one is, I guess that from your presentation and comments, it is relatively clear what developing countries might gain of intervening in or investing in this sort of business. But then what is perhaps not clear to me at this moment is what are the costs for developing countries of this type of business? And then what do multinational companies or corporations want from developing countries? And then the second question is, how can developing countries maneuver this geopolitical context of being perceived as aligned with either of the superpowers, and then the consequences of it?
Thank you. Yeah, great. Could you pass the mic just down to?
Hi, firstly, thanks so much for the presentation so far. I know there's a really good point about countries kind of stopping to think before getting into digitalization.
Talk right into it.
Sorry. But I was wondering a bit about countries who are already kind of entrenched in, say, digital BRI, like, for example, Algeria or Egypt, who are maybe at risk of lock-in effect and stuff that was mentioned. So what kind of practical steps can be taken on a domestic level now for countries who are already at that kind of stage to maximize their domestic agency at the moment when they're already involved, if that makes sense?
Okay, why don't you go for those three questions?
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you for these questions. Well, James, I'm going to start with your own question. That's a tough one. No, I completely agree. I mean, when you look at the literature on technology transfer and technological capabilities and innovation, there's very little that suggests that countries can just like jumpstart the whole process, and like examples of leapfrogging are very rare. A lot of it is about emulating and building capacity through the process of emulation before being able to kind of gain more ownership over the technology and then adjust it and have the capacity to innovate according to the local context and local configurations of skills, of resources and power. The problem in the cases I study and the way this segment of the digital sector is evolving is that increasingly these corporations build their whole system around kind of very closed loop systems whereby all of their components very much come from one place. They would trust their suppliers in Shenzhen or elsewhere and would not necessarily build those linkages that are so important to the process of knowledge diffusion and technology diffusion. So, with global value chains and the way there has been restructuring in this sector, there are less and less opportunities actually for technology transfer in the way it happened in China through building these channels and connections. And that poses a real problem for countries trying to catch up. However, on a more optimistic note and on the software side, there is some hope with more open access models. And this, speaking with engineers in both Algeria and Egypt, that there is potentially a path forward with more open access softwares and models. The question on the cost for developing countries and what FDI and these corporations want from developing countries, well, the main answer is markets. We're talking about capitalist firms that want to maximize their profit in the global economy. And for the Chinese firms in recent years, with all the sanctions from Western countries, from the US and so on, developing country markets have become very important for firms like Huawei and ZTE. When you could look at the kind of share of revenues for Huawei in recent years, countries in the so-called global south have been very important for them because they're increasingly kind of being kind of rolled out from European markets and the US market. I think that, the main important, like I wouldn't say like some people want to attribute a lot of intentionality to what some of these firms are doing and that they're like actors of this big geopolitical project. But in reality, a lot of what happened, and even the diffusion of Chinese norms and standards and stuff, is mostly unintentional effects from the presence and the dominance of these firms in these markets. So one should not kind of fall in the trap of these big narratives of China trying to control the global internet or the digital economies of developing countries. On the question of like what can be done now for countries to kind of maximize their profit, unfortunately, when talking to policymakers in the 2 North African countries I studied, I find that a lot want to have the latest technology. There was a big rush at the time I was doing fieldwork to expand Algeria's 4G network, for instance. And so there is this drive to seek efficiency instead of like thinking of what could maximize learning and capacity building domestically. And that has to do with often like domestic political pressures. Governments want to deliver, like if the neighboring country now has 5G, the country also wants to have 5G and so on. And so there isn't much time to reflect on the type of infrastructure is being acquired and kind of what the country is gaining in the process. And this has to do with kind of institutional incentives and so on. But yeah, I'm going to leave the opportunity for Kenddrick to add something.
Sure. Thanks very much, Finn. So I'll just take one question, very easily, which is how should countries navigate this, great power politics or geopolitics, amidst their own domestic ambitions, right? So, a diplomat from Singapore, a very senior diplomat from Singapore, once wrote in his book that was published in 2017 that brilliant ideas from small countries can be easily discarded if inconvenient. But silly ideas, stupid ideas from big countries have to be taken very, 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 very seriously by their capacity to act upon them. I will respectfully disagree, right? And I think that this argument is very reductionist. It doesn't leave room for agency. And as to the question again, right? How should countries manage geopolitics? I think there are examples from around the world, right? I mean, if you look across the map all the way to Southeast Asia, we see this idea of enmeshment, where they seek to get involved with the US or the West militarily, or at the same time economically, they deepen linkages with China. So in the sense, they are using, for the lack of a better term, right? They are maximizing their agency. They are playing both sides in a way to benefit their own domestic growth. I think there are some lessons to be learned from that. It's never perfect. It's an imperfect example, but I think that's kind of the nature of the international system, international politics as it is. So I hope that gives some insight.
Thank you very much. Let me just see the hands here now. We have one here, up there. There's somebody up there. Okay, we'll go.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have 2 questions. So I wanted to perhaps challenge the geopolitical landscape that we're assuming. Maybe I might be wrong. I'll just put it out there. So some argue that we're kind of living in a multipolar world. And so I'm curious, especially as we're highlighting the agency of African countries, what is the role of the AU or even like the AU through BRICS in terms of creating that agency? And then I had a question. So you did mention about state capabilities. I was curious about kind of that interaction between the state and private enterprises. So for example, we know that the creation of cassava technologies, for example, by Strive from Zimbabwe. So what should that state, and he's an entrepreneur, so what should that relation between the state and him kind of be like to kind of facilitate kind of sovereignty in this sector?
Thank you. Was there somebody else up here? No. Okay, down here, we have some. If you could pass the.
Thank you for your insight. My question is about how to evaluate the development implications of the digital infrastructures. You have mentioned about, for example, the technology transfers and spillovers, but for me it's more about the technological per se. Like it's also shown in the experience of China that much economy is boosted with the application of these with this digital technology, such as e-commerce or what we see as the live stream economy. So would you include that in the developmental implication in your study? How would you evaluate it? Is it are the applications booming in developing countries, or if not, what is impeding these initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions here? No? Okay, I'm going to put the third. Oh, there is one up there. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. And I wanted to ask what both speakers think about some throwaway remarks on China's investments on the African continent, being characterized as a new scramble for Africa.
Okay, that's really good. And I'm going to ask the last one, then give you both a chance to respond. In order for people to adjourn to be able, did you have one? Okay, we have two more then. And then they can get out for trick-or-treating.
Excuse me. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation and discussion. So I have two very quick questions, one for Tin and one for Kenddrick.
Kate, right into the, yeah.
Okay, sorry. For Tin, you talked about localization of data centers as something that was good for sovereignty, but not really realizing the potential of that localization. And I'm wondering if you could comment on whether actually a bigger risk comes along with that, in that data centers require a huge amount of water and electricity in countries that don't always have a lot of that to go around. So to what extent do you see localization of data centers as also a very clever way of some of these big tech giants, China and in the US, to get developing countries to absorb the intensive water and electricity costs? And then for Kenddrick, I'm curious about how you see the evolution of the politicization of the technical side of digitization. My sense was Chinese tech became a national security risk at just about the time that China was in a position to license 5G technology so that European and North American countries would have to pay royalties to China for that technology. So to what extent is this, excuse me, politicization really about preventing China from getting into an economic position in which European and North American countries, particularly the US, are economically subordinate rather than things about national security, etc.?
Okay, that's great. That actually preempts my last question. So I'm going to turn it over to you to give answers to this set of questions before we adjourn.
I'll start by answering the question, right, on how should the continent, how should African agency be exercised. I think it's very clear. Over 50 votes all of the 170 something countries at the UN. But I think it's almost 1/3. There was a great book written in 2013 by, edited by Sophie Harmon, who talks about, how the African agency in international politics, drawing upon the example. My favorite one is Uganda, right? How were they able to, extract and gain more concessions from the US, even when the structural balance of power, so to speak, was not in their favor. So I think that's a great start. I think I would highly recommend that book, which is basically what they did was that they ran a very strong anti-terror campaign in the 6 months up to George W. Bush's visit, and then they were able to use that to say, you know what, we actually align, we're on the same side, etc., etc. That's why you should give us more money. And that's what happened, right? In a nutshell, I mean, I'm very sure I put a very brutal version of that sophisticated argument, but yeah. Also, just to very quickly address, the question, which is, how do I see the evolution, of this sort of contestation, political contestation over the technical aspects of, technology? And I think my take on it is that it's not so much for national security, but more on commercial advantage. If you look at the development of certain technologies, Japan was a fast mover, very, very fast mover for 3G. And you had all these big Japanese companies and they just pushed. And yes, that led to licensing and eventually commercial advantage. The US was very fast for 4G, but they have been quite slow on the 5G aspect of things, which is why now you tend to see certain security considerations being floated up. That would be my suspicion, right? But having interacted with a couple of engineers at the working level, they are all, even to this day, I mean, I last spoke to them, I think it's 2018, which is the time where Trump actually went after Huawei, with the listing and sort of things from the Play Store, can't use their OS, things like that. And the engineers are like, okay, but how do we move forward with this? So, to this day, I think I sense that they are still trying to come to grips with the changing political environment. So, the technical and the political aren't always separate, but people in the technical are still trying to make sense, and also the other way around.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for these great questions. I'm going to start with the question on state-business relations. I think that's a very important aspect, and I didn't have much time in the presentation to go into details, but in every big infrastructural initiative and so on, that there are obviously winners and losers. And I think from the two case studies here, some of the most important losers were local tech firms. These were often marginalized, and speaking with local ICT original equipment manufacturers in Algeria and Egypt, there was this sense that they were often marginalized for the interest of bigger groups, and they have expressed the idea that there wasn't enough trust in them, and that there weren't initiatives that were allowing them to capture greater shares of the market. And sometimes they felt that they had the capacity to conduct some of the projects, but the way the public tenders were issued and written was basically excluding them de facto, because it was putting a really high requirement on capital and resources that they couldn't meet. So that's a very important issue, and it has to do with industrial policies, with the objectives of different governments in place. But there is definitely a need to rethink a bit the approach and the role of local firms, including in data center provisions. Because, I do study 2 middle-income countries that have, I would say, decent capabilities in both the markets. So there's definitely more that can be done with local firms. On the question of data centers and energy, that's a great question. And the ones I study here are smaller data centers that require a bit less energy. They're enterprise data centers. But what you're describing of big tech groups going to developing countries and try to use water resources and energy resources is definitely true, mainly for hyperscalers. So these are this super large energy intensive data centers, and it creates huge risks because, as you know, AI training and these data centers consume huge amounts of water, and energy, and it creates real environmental issues. Now there is some innovation. Actually, Huawei is really big on its solar-driven data centers. So most of the computing power comes from solar energy, and they're using countries like Algeria and Egypt for their great solar potential. There's a lot of talk about aligning the digital transition with the environmental transition, trying to have like data centers powered by clean tech. But that's definitely an aspect worth exploring more and looking at the political economy of that. The question of applications and like digital platforms, I'm mainly interested in my research on like the links and the linkages built between foreign technology firms and the local economy. There are plenty of applications, as you mentioned, like developing in the countries I study, but often the software world generates less linkages than kind of infrastructural firms and like kind of ICT, large-scale backbone infrastructure constructors. So I'm mainly interested in that. But if your question is, are we seeing the appearance and development of domestic applications and digital applications, then yes, that definitely there is a lot of this. But then there's big questions about to what extent these are actually profitable and to what extent they have the capacity to grow and expand to other markets. That's like a whole debate. And there's excellent literature showing that the work also generated by these platforms is not really kind of fulfilling. There's a lot of exploitation happening in the gig economy. So it's not necessarily, something that we should perceive as inherently developmental. It's quite problematic in many ways.
The other part of Kate's question asked about security. There's a big security story that's being told, a lot of demonology about it, and one wonders how much of that is a reality and how much of it is to kind of cover what is essentially a real challenge, commercial challenge that's coming from China.
Yeah. This is a crucial point. Actually, in one of my interviews, I was speaking with the Minister of the Digital Economy, and I asked this specific question, James, and about the security aspect. And I was clearly told that for a middle-income country that didn't have that many resources, often the choice when it comes to upgrading or expanding digital infrastructure is between kind of choosing who is going to spy upon you, right? Like, do you want more the US and the Western countries to have access to your data, or do you pick China? And often I thought it was very grim but realistic as an answer. And as long as you don't have the capacity to build your indigenous kind of technologies and have ownership over this strategic infrastructure, it's very difficult to talk of digital sovereignty.
I have a bit more optimism, I think, as some of these security risks, and they're actually very, very valid ones, but I think if you're talking about them in terms of commercial products, I think the security considerations, right, take a different dimension. So, when we think of security, we think of, like countries shouldn't be over-reliant on one particular vendor, because then you risk vendor lock-in. It's very hard, your upgrades and whatsoever, security patches, so then you are at the mercy of that particular vendor. However, the reason I am optimistic is because there have been recent developments, well, not recent, they are already close to 4 to 5 years old. There have been recent moves within industry to increase the interoperability within systems. If we look at like data center infrastructure, there's this excellent project called Open Compute Platform, where they release and publish certain standards called OCP standards, where they allow interoperability. The closest example I could think of is your USB-C cable, right? It goes into your computer, it goes into your phone, it could go in many places. So I think, with that drive, we see now there's a greater market, it's a large companies in the market, equipment providers, OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, the OCP stamp has become a stamp in which companies and procurers are looking out for, right? So it means that I could buy a rack from provider A and then a server from provider B, and they would go and scale accordingly. They will be fine. They will work with each other. So I think hopefully, that works out. and that my faith in my optimism is not placed in the wrong area.
So good to end on an optimistic note. I want to remind you before we say thank you that we reconvened this series in week 7 after reading week with quite a dynamic lineup headed by Naila Kabir on gender justice. So please, keep it in mind, get yourself rested, have a good time this evening. You can join us now, if you like, at the White Horse Pub to talk to the speakers for a little while. So let's thank our 2 speakers for a really fantastic session.